Hey guys, my name is Clay Williams, and today I want to talk to you about non-metallic gold. Now, non-metallics, meaning the paints are not metallic when we put them on the palette. So no true gold with sparkly paint pigments in them and no true silvers. So to start out with, I took some reference pictures on my phone of the object that I'm going to be painting, which is a shoulder pad and gauntlet. And what that did for me is it shows me where the brightest reflections are on that object at that angle. So I kind of turned the object until I saw how the light was reflecting off the object itself, and then took a picture of it. And I'm going to use that while I'm painting the model to control where my light source is going to be with the non-metallic gold. Now, I want to start by taking my white paint, which is the Vallejo Game Color Arctic White, and I'm actually going to sketch in where I want my strongest highlights to be first. So we want this to be fairly opaque. You don't have to water it down much. And what I'm doing is I'm looking at the object as it was oriented in the pictures, and I'm going to mark out where my strong highlights are. Now, while you're painting this, you're going to notice that the light that's reflecting on this object is changing as you're painting because you're turning it, and the light's changing as how it reflects toward your eye. And I want to ignore that. What I want to do is mark out where I see the light on the picture that I took as reference. And this can be pretty rough. Again, we're just sketching in where our highlights are going to be. And this white will actually help us coat over our black primer for our yellows that we're going to add for the non-metallic shine. So I'm going to do this shoulder pad, the little small plate underneath it, and the bracer. And so now that I have my highlights kind of sketched in, I want to start on the shadow area. So I'm going to add a little bit of this Vallejo Air Armor Brown, or Model Air. And since these are air paints, they're pretty thin, so I don't need to thin them down. And again, using my reference, I'm going to paint in where my shadow areas are going to be. And again, this is a pretty thick layer. And we'll probably need about 2 coats of this Armor Brown before we start blending it up with some of our yellow color. So if you think about the color of gold without its metallic shine, it's basically yellow. So you can choose any yellow you want, and this can help you develop paint schemes, whether you're using a super saturated yellow like we're going to use today, or a more muted yellow. All right, so while that is drying, I'm going to get some of my gold yellow from Vallejo on my palette. There we go. All right, so now that we have our yellow on our palette, I'm going to take some of this Armor Brown, and I'm going to mix some of my gold yellow into it, just a little bit, just a tiny step up. What I'm going to do is where I've put this Armor Brown as my base coat, I'm going to put it right next, even on top of that Armor Brown. And I'm going to go ahead and do the other side too. We'll come back to the back side of the model because I want to talk a little bit about how to address lighting on a 3D object from several directions. And again, with this, with using browns and yellows, you're going to need several coats of paint, especially to get good blends. And the yellow, as you get farther toward that yellow over this black, it's going to take a few more coats. Once we start adding white into the yellow, you'll notice that it coats a little bit better. All right, my same pool of paint here with my Armor Brown in it. Just adding a little bit more yellow each time as I'm working my way toward these white highlights that I have. Now in this small little area in between these stark highlights, I want to start building up my yellow as well. I didn't want to start with the Armor Brown there because it would be too quick of a transition. And I don't want to spend all day trying to blend a tiny little section of the model when I have a whole model to paint. And again, to make it blend a little bit easier, pull your yellows from your shadow toward your highlight. If I'm working with highlights, I want to pull toward my highlight. If I'm working with shadows, I want to pull toward my shadow. And again, as we get a coat down, mix a little more yellow into your Armor Brown. Make sure your previous layer's dry. And pull toward your highlight. So here we kind of got to make a, in this corner of the shoulder, we have to pull outward toward our white. And it's going to need a few more coats. Now we're thinking about non-metallic metal. It's less about how you apply the paint and more about where your highlights are. It's a trick of the eye, or tricking the eye. You want to think about shape and how those shapes are going to interact with light. And that's why I have my cheat. I'm here building outward in this circle, pulling this yellow toward my white. And it's okay if it gets on the white because we're going to re-highlight there and kind of smooth out those sketches we got. I know a lot of people prime in black, so it's important to learn how to highlight over that black. We're getting close to having enough yellow in our Armor Brown to go to the pure yellow here and there to coat around our stark highlight. I'll go back and hit with some Armor Brown here on the lip, the edge of the pauldron. We'll paint the edge of this pauldron and leave just the center of those. Because we might want to put, silver trim or a colored unit marking around the edges of those arm plates. So go into my straight yellow. And now I don't want to add my white where I had my Armor Brown, because what it's going to do is going to kind of desaturate that Armor Brown in the white. So I want to take some of my gold yellow, add it to another area of my palette, and start adding my white to that. And then just like as we were working toward the highlight with the previous layers, we want to work out from our sketch toward the shadows with our next layers. And so you see I'm kind of pulling outward because I'm working toward my shadows. And it's okay if your paint looks a little sketchy because we're working on black with yellow, and it's going to take a few coats before we get that opacity that we're looking for. The benefit to a color that coats slower is that it's going to be easier to blend. So blues, greens, dark purples are going to be a little bit harder to blend because they coat so well. And if you have your brush too loaded, or the paint's too thin, or you get the brush in a spot you don't want it, then that paint is going to immediately coat. So you're gonna see that mistake really quick. If you're working with yellows and reds and those colors that just refuse to lay down on the model, then if you make a mistake, it's gonna be harder to see. And I'm sort of working back and forth on this pauldron here. Now your ratio of highlight to shadow should be about 2/3 to 1/3. That's a good starting spot. You want 2/3 shadow color and 1/3 mid-tone to highlight. Now, that shadow is actually what's going to give you the illusion of an object being shiny. I'll go in and take my white again and kind of reestablish where my highlight and sketch was. Plus, since it's white, it does need another layer to coat. And so you can sort of see the development of the light rolling down the model and all reflecting from the same area. And when I'm working with non-metallics, I go back and forth between my colors a lot. But you don't need a whole lot of colors when you're working with it. You don't need to have a light yellow, a medium brown, a yellow brown. You can just take a few colors and mix them on your palette. Now each one of these objects is a little bit different. We have sort of a cylinder shape here. We have just a curved surface here, and then we have more of a sphere for the shoulder pad. And each one of those objects is going to reflect light a little bit differently, and that's something to think about when you're painting non-metallic metals. How does that object reflect light? For this spherical shape with the two lines next to it, the reason the camera picked up light here and here next to the crevices is because this object is reflecting light back at each other. So a 90-degree intersection, those objects, those flat panels are going to reflect light against each other. It's kind of like the light gets trapped in that crevice and bounces back and forth. And then, of course, the spot highlight that's on this sphere at the forward point where our eye is looking at the object. Kind of the same with this curved shape here. Bringing my yellow in. And then when I'm feeling comfortable with my highlights, I'm going to go in with my armor brown, just kind of the pure armor brown. Since it's an airbrush paint, it's already thin. And go in and hit these cracks and crevices. And this is working a little bit like a glaze. You can see it sort of smooth out the layers below it and help those transitions blend a little bit better. And at this point, I shouldn't need my reference anymore, but I'm gonna leave it up just in case. I'm always sort of in the early stages, looking in the corner of my eye at that reference that I took earlier. Reinforcing my shadow colors again. Again, it's okay to work back and forth on the model, going to areas that need a little more attention. And use your fingers as tools. They make good erasers when you get paint where you don't want it. Now, if I want this gold to look a little more interesting, I have a highlight here that seems pretty rounded, but I want to pull this highlight maybe atop the top of this bracer. So I gotta take my white, and I'm gonna actually go in, and I'm gonna add a little bit of highlight that didn't exist in my reference photo. And that's more to create interest and less to create realism. And if you see me wiping paint on my thumb, what I'm doing is I'm sort of training the brush, and I'm actually unloading the paint. So if you think about dry brushing, when you dry brush, you load your paintbrush, and then you unload it. And that helps you control the amount of paint that's on the brush. You want to do the same thing when you're layering. You want to control the amount of paint that's on your brush. You don't just want to dip it in the paint and hope that you have the right amount of paint on the brush. You want to think about that. All right, so I have a little rivet here in the corner. I don't have to focus on blending that so much, so I'm just going to put some brighter yellow on top of that, and then give it a little white highlight. Going to reinforce a few of my white highlights here. All right, so when I said we have to think about reflections in a 3D space when we're working with non-metallic metal, if I look at this object from where I've painted it, it looks good. If I turn it around, there's nothing there, and that's not interesting. What we want to do is take that reference photo where I took a picture of the back side of the model and do the same thing that we did on the front, and use that reference to create some interest on the back of the model. So my shadow lines up in each one of these photos from where it started for the previous image. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this reference point and sketch out my highlights for the backside. And so we have our starting point again to match the front side of our object. And like before, we're going to work toward our highlight with our yellow. What we don't want to do is cover up our shadow area. I want to keep in mind that there is a break point where that shadow area began that we have finished, and we don't want to paint over that. And thinking about that 1/3 rule is that when I'm working with these two colors, this is going to be 1/3, this is going to be 2/3 of my area. A lot of shadow area. That's where the majority of our work's going to be. Slowly increasing the amount of yellow that I have in my brown as I get toward my white until I'm almost pure yellow again. And again, always looking for opportunities to make the model more interesting and be able to point out detail while sometimes foregoing that realism for the sake of just looking cool. So if we look at the way that the shoulder pad is starting to develop, it kind of goes against our intuition of how we would highlight a shoulder pad. Because usually the top middle section of the shoulder pad is going to be the brightest area on a matte object, the way it reflects. But this is starting to develop where the corners are the bright spots, because if we're looking at a character on the field, we're going to see them from straight on. We're not going to be looking at them from the top. And so that's going to give us our illusion of bright light reflecting toward the viewer instead of just being brighter because the sun's above them or the lights in the room are above them. And again, since we're working with acrylic paints, don't worry about the things that you aren't painting and that haven't been painted yet, because we're always going to go back over those. Now, as far as brushes go, I do recommend a nice detail brush for when you're working just about all the time. I use a Winsor Newton Series 7 size 0 as my workhorse brush. I paint rough with it, I paint detail with it, I pull lines and patterns and freehand. The only thing I don't do is I don't use washes with it. And I don't use inks with it, because washes and inks will destroy brushes really quickly. If you want to use washes and inks, get a cheap brush. You can go to any hobby store and find a pack of brushes that'll, for a couple bucks, that'll work really good for using your washes. Now for the back side of this arm, again, for the sake of interest over realism, I'm going to not go as stark with my highlights. I'm not going to go all the way to white. I might put a few little white pips here, but you should always keep the back side of your model a little bit darker, because you want people to view it for the front. Most of the cool things are going to be on the front of the model. And as human beings, we usually respond to people facing us and not turning their backs to us. All right. Again, we can sit here all day and blend, or if we're army painting, we can decide we need to stop at a certain point. So what I'm doing is that I'm just taking a little bit of pure white here, and I'm reinforcing the middle of our highlights. And I'm using a really thick brush load, because when we highlight, the paint actually has texture, and the paint is actually going to catch light as well. So if I have a little rounded shape of white paint in the middle of my highlight area, it's going to give me that extra punch of light that I need just from the ambient light. So I'm using the shape of the paint to actually improve the look of the model. Now, I think that's about all the work we want to do on the non-metallic gold. So this is the finished gold. In just a little bit of time, with a few colors, we were able to create a non-metallic illusion on our model for gold. And that's it.